Now let's look at the government support in terms of the social benefits. In terms of global pension assets, Australia ranks number 4 in the world behind USA, UK, and Japan. And in terms of the pension assets per person, because of Australia's population only at 25.6 million people per head, Australia also ranks number 3, just behind Switzerland and Netherlands in terms of the pension assets per head. Now, to give you some more concrete background information about how the Australian government supports its people, since the eruption of the pandemic, COVID 19, these figures are the figures of the amount of money injected by each country's government into its economy. Okay, so USA has injected 2.3 trillion US dollars worth of money into its economy, and Australia has injected 133.5 billion into its economy. Now, to put this into context, when it comes to helping employers keep employees in the workforce, Australia has this program called JobKeeper, which basically allows the government to pump $3,000 per person, per employee, to the employer in order for the employer to then pay the employee this money to keep the employee in the job. Okay. Plus, there are also other tax benefits, which is said to be in the order of about 300 billion. So there is close to perhaps 400 to 500 billion US dollars worth of the social benefits that the government has pumped, the Australian government has pumped into the economy to assist with job force and the economy. Okay, so that in comparison to what China has done, close to 170 billion, Germany close to 190 billion, Australia being relatively a small population, the government has done a lot in terms of keeping the economy going and keeping the unemployment rate low, and also delivering social and health benefits to its people. Okay, so the Australian government has been very supportive to its people since the eruption of the pandemic. So this is just one of the examples of the government support. Now looking at Australia's nature in Northern Territory, you probably recognise this little cute animal here, koala. This is the Great Barrier Reef, and in a few states in Australia we've got pink lakes. So there are many places to look out for if you want to tour around. Australia has some of the beautiful natural spots on planet Earth. So that's about the environment in Australia. Now let's look at the lifestyle in Australia. So as we mentioned previously, about 80% of Australia's population, if not more, live around the coast. Okay, everybody loves to live near the beach, so pretty much everybody wants to live around the coast here. And tracing back the ancestry from probably 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, it was when the Aboriginal Australians first lived in Australia with their own culture, and then followed by the British colony. So Australia is home to the world's oldest continuous cultures. Okay, and if you look at the survey conducted by the Australian Bureau of Stats, looking at the percentage of population tracing back, the top 10 largest, most common ancestry per family, a lot of the people came from England, and some of them had multiple generations of Australian family, Irish, Scottish, and then followed by immigrants from other countries, including China and also Europe and India. Diversity. So 1 in 4 Australians were born overseas, 26%, and 1 in 2 Australians have an overseas born parent. The overseas migration represented 60% of Australia's population growth The other 40% obviously with newborn. 1 in 5 of Australians, that's about 20%, speak a language other than English at home. And out of everybody who migrated to Australia, it includes UK, New Zealand, China, India, Vietnam, followed by others. So Australia has a wide diversity of cultures, which include food. Okay, so you probably recognize here are the Asian food. You've got the spring rolls, the dumplings, the noodles, and then here you've got curry. So this is more or less the Indian, Malaysian kind of food. Typically, Australians love to eat hamburgers and fries and things like that. Okay, and here is some typical Australian food, which include Tim Tam, the chocolate biscuits, as well as the Vegemite, something that Australians love to eat for breakfast. So there's a wide variety of food as well in Australia. In terms of transport, most people commute to work using cars. It's by far the most popular transport used in Australia. A lot of people catch trains to and from work and also planes. So here is one of Australia's own brands, Qantas is the Australian plane. And in certain cities in Australia, particularly in the metro places, there are this thing called trams. Okay, it helps with the environment because these things run purely based on electricity. So they generally a very common way of transport for people within the CBDs. Okay, so these are the 4 most common transport used in Australia. Okay, in terms of numbers, close to 6.6 million people commute to work using cars, followed by trains. A lot of people actually love to walk, followed by bus and trucks. Okay, so because Australia is very large in size, in the land size, and relatively small amount of population, so if you don't have a car in Australia, it's really going to make your life difficult. So pretty much every family has a car. Okay, most families have multiple cars. And in terms of the livability or cost of living, comparing Australia to other countries, let's say with Sydney, this is measured in euro. So the cost of living, if we're measured in euro, it's around $2,100. That's on a monthly basis, a monthly average, which is less expensive than most other cities like Singapore, Tokyo, Beijing. It's about the same as Dubai. It's about twice as high as Johannesburg, close to probably 25% more than Mexico City, and about half of Mexico, London, and New York. Okay, so just to give you an example, to buy a carton of milk of about 2 litres, it would cost somewhere between $2.50 to $3.50. Okay, so it's relatively, the cost of living is relatively low in Australia. Okay, in comparison to what is probably the highest rate of payment in Australia. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why a lot of the cities in Australia rank in the top 10 most livable cities. Apart from the environment, the cost of living is also a very important factor. So that's about the life in Australia. Okay, and let's look at the Australian economy and what are the drivers of Australia's economy. And so when we talk about Australian economy, the key word there is stability. Australia is the only country that has 28 years of uninterrupted annual economic growth. Now, this is prior to the pandemic. 28 years, that's very stable growth. And when you look at the world's top 20 largest economies, Australia ranks number 14, and comparing to Australia's population, the country is doing pretty good. Okay, it's ahead of Mexico, Netherlands, behind Spain, Russia, and South Korea. Okay, all those countries that rank higher than Australia or have higher population or larger population than Australia. And so what drives the Australian economy? There are a few major drivers. The first and foremost is the investment fund, assets, or the finance industry. Okay, Australia has the sixth largest in the world in terms of its investment fund. Merchandise export. Australia is among the top three in the world in terms of export of mining and fuels, particularly exporting iron ore and coal to countries like China. International tourism. Australia ranks seventh largest in the world in terms of receiving um, incoming international tourists. Foreign students in tertiary education. Australia is the third largest in the world in terms of having the most popular universities. And we just saw that in the top 100, there are 7 or 8 Australian universities in the top 100 universities. So it's one of the most popular destinations for international students. And of course, agriculture. So producing things like wheat, barley, beef. Australia is the top 12 in the world in terms of export of agriculture. So as you can see here, there are different industries or different drivers for Australia's economy, predominantly the finance, the agriculture, the farming, and also services industry, in education and tourism. Okay, so generally those economic drivers are pretty long-term and very stable drivers. Australia, maybe this is something that takes you by surprise. Australia is the world's leading producer of gold and all those precious metals like gold, copper, silver, and as we said previously, iron ore. It exports a lot to Asian countries. Okay, so all those production of resources contribute quite heavily to Australia's GDP, okay, making Australia a very stable economy. And in terms of the exports market, China is by far Australia's largest trading partner with 116 billion US dollars worth of trade on an annual basis, followed by Japan, and then countries like South Korea, USA, India, and the rest of the world. Now, since the eruption of the pandemic, a lot of the countries have shown negative growth in terms of its economy. In fact, almost all countries have shown backward economy. Okay, so for example, China has suffered close to minus 10% in terms of its GDP growth, but Australia has remained pretty resilient to the pandemic in terms of its economy. Okay, and we just saw that those factors, when it comes to food, infrastructure, finance, all those more or less sort of service-based industries and the international trade remain quite strong, even that we have this pandemic going on. Talking about technology in Australia, Australia has very strong tech credentials. There are 700 fintech startups, so in this case it's financial technology, all right, 500 medtech companies, medical technology, edtech, 350 education tech companies, and 300 agtech, being agricultural and food technology companies. So again, those companies are pretty much fueling the major economic drivers, as we just saw, in terms of finance, education, and also agriculture. The venture capitalists, the VCs, are also very active in Australia, funding new technology startups, okay, enabling innovation and more workforce, more jobs to be created in those spaces. We just saw that China is Australia's largest trading partner, but in terms of investment partner, USA is Australia's largest investment partner. Okay, with more than 26% of the foreign investment in Australia coming from the US, and with Australia's money going out, more than 28% of Australia's foreign investment goes to the USA, followed by UK, Belgium, Japan, and then China ranks number 7. Okay, so both having both China as its trading partner and USA as its largest investment partner Australia is really enjoying having two powerhouses in terms of its trade and investment, which again makes Australia one of the stable countries in the world in terms of its economy. Now, with relation to how easy it is to do business or how easy it is to create business, in some countries, taking example, for example, China, if you were to create a company, it can take days, if not weeks. Okay, whereas in Australia, a lot of things can be done on the internet. Okay, in order to create a company, to start a business, you can register a company online. It can take maybe half an hour, 1 hour. If you need to open up a bank account in Australia, either as a business owner or as an individual, whether you are an Australian resident or you're a foreigner, that can be done within hours as well. So both in terms of starting the business, registering the company name, putting shareholders in place, as well as opening the bank account, the whole package, that can be done within a day. Okay, so that's relatively fast, and that's just one of the examples of how easy it is to do business in Australia. In terms of governments and business efficiencies, Australia also ranks top 5 in most of the categories in terms of social capital, debt dynamics, complexity of tariff, soundness of banks, and all other factors. Because most things can be done on the internet, and also Australia is very expensive in terms of human labour, so a lot of those things can be done online. Now, in terms of workforce and job market, in a country with 25 million population, there are about 12 million of people that actually have a job. Okay, so considering the fact that there are children and the retirees out there, for people who are between 15 to 65 years of age, Australia is among the top 10 in terms of the employment rate. Okay, so 12 million people are actually employed, okay, making Australia a very stable country in the workforce. And in terms of the job market, how skilled, or in terms of the skilled workforce, the diversity of workforce, willingness to delegate authority, and all those different categories, Australia ranks quite consistently in the top 10 in most categories. Okay, so that's about the economy. We'll learn about the drivers of economy, keeping Australia economy stable, and also the fact that Australia has China as its largest trading partner, and USA as its largest investment partner, both countries keeping Australia very stable in its economy. And let's look at education. Now, before we head to the education sector of Australia, let's think through this question. What if we don't have this thing called Wi-Fi? How would our life be? How would our life look like without Wi-Fi? Or what happens if we don't have ultrasound, in terms of medical treatment? Or what if we don't have IVF? Or what if the planes do not have black boxes? All those items, all those discoveries were actually innovations from Australia. And to be more precise, most of them actually come from laboratories in the Australian tertiary education sectors. So with all those items, penicillin, IVF, ultrasound, Wi-Fi, black boxes, there are over 1 billion people around the world that rely on Australian discoveries and innovations every day. Most of them come from the tertiary sectors. Okay, those are the international success. Now, a few facts about Australia's education. Australia ranks 3rd place in terms of the most popular international student destination after UK and USA, but knowing that we only have a population of 25 million people, 25.6 million people. So this is slightly out of date. That's probably a few years ago. But Australia still ranks number 3. Okay, out of the 30 best student cities in the world, there are 5 that are in Australia that are most popular for students. Every year, there is just under 200 million Australian dollars pumped by the Australian government into international scholarships, okay, as a government investment. And if you're wondering what sort of subjects or different sectors that the education, particularly the tertiary education, focuses on, well, there is a variety. Arts, humanity, engineering and technology is very strong in UTS in Sydney, as well as the University of Melbourne. Life science, very strong in the University of Melbourne. Arts and humanities, very strong in the Australian Capital University, and so on and so forth. And Australia ranks number 9 in the world, ahead of Germany, New Zealand, and Japan in terms of university system ranking. Okay, so these are just some of the facts about Australia's education, which is why a lot of the international students rush to Australia for tertiary education. Now, some of the achievement from education sector, Australia ranks number 1 in terms of technological readiness, in terms of innovation, 3rd highest in terms of the number of universities in the top 100 around the world. We just saw that figure. And almost half, 1 in 2 of Australian firms are innovation active, always creating new things. Australia ranks 5th in terms of global entrepreneurship, the numbers and the quality, and the CSIRO ranks the top 1% of the world's scientific institutions, and around 43% of Australia's workforce has a tertiary qualification, whether it's university or TAFE. So we saw earlier that the education index, Australia ranks equally number 1 with Denmark. That's something that says a lot about the quality of people in the workforce produced from the education sector. Okay, so that's a few things about education. Now let's dive into the property market. Now, before we look at the actual property market, let's just refresh ourselves on Property Economy 101, okay? The supply and the demand. In this case, the demand is how many people want dwellings, want the properties, and the supply is how many properties are there in the marketplace for people to purchase. So let's look at last year in terms of newborn babies. There is just over 300,000 newborn babies, and the number of people who died last year was just under 150,000. If you take away the 150,000 from the newborn babies, we have a net positive newborn figure of 152,000 last year. So that's the newborn. But with the migrants coming into Australia, there is just under 500,000. And if you take away people that are living in Australia, you have a net migration figure of positive 212,000. And so if you add them up, we have close to about 365,000 people, of which 42,000 are the newborn and 58% are the net migrants growth. So that's about 1,000 people per day. Okay, close to 365,000 people per year in terms of the growing demand. But in terms of the supply, Australian property industry, or the housing industry, it's actually undersupply by 250,000 dwellings overall. Okay, and that's been increasing at more than 15,000, 20,000 negative figure per year. Okay, so every year there's consistently being shortage of housing supply, which means that property price is going to go up because there is more demand than supply. Okay, so with shortage of housing supply, people will then compete to purchase new homes or established homes, creating that demand, even though that demand is already in the marketplace, but there will be more and more demand created, whether it's newborn, young families, or migrants coming to Australia to compete for housing, and therefore driving the property price up. And so, speaking of having property price driven up, let's look at a few factors that actually influence the property value. And more often than not, those are the factors that are related to the property or the suburb itself. So first of all, location, location, location. You've heard it many times, and that means a lot to a property. Two properties, A and B, could look exactly the same, exactly the number of bedrooms, bathrooms, configuration, but the only thing that those two properties must be different are the locations. Okay, so different locations can mean completely different prices. Even if two properties are side by side, one could be in the school zone and one is probably not in the school zone, and they could be differ by up to 20, 25, 30% in price. Okay, so location is something that is irreplaceable, and in my opinion, that's the first and foremost thing, the most important thing when it comes to selecting property for investment. The seller's time frame. Okay, in Australia, the property market goes through different cycles, right? The ups and downs, but the overall trend is that it goes up. But if you sell at the peak of the market, you're going to make a hell of a lot more money. But if you buy at the bottom of the markets, you are going to be assured that you'll make money. Okay, so in my opinion, you don't necessarily make money in property when you sell. You actually make money in real estate when you buy. If you buy at the right time and with the right terms at the right price, you are going to make money from day one. Okay, so the seller's time frame, buyer's time frame, buying and selling at the right timing of the market, at the right cycle of the market is very important. Improvements. Does your property or house have floorboards, have new tiles, have new windows? All those improvements, they would add the value to your property. Okay, having them versus not having them would create big differences. Okay, and that's similar to condition of the property. Is your property a new property or is it an old property? Right. The different factors in the condition of the property can determine, maybe up to 60, 70% of the price. If you have a great location, great block of land, but a property is very run down compared to a great location and a brand new property, we could be talking about $1 million, $2 million worth of difference. Okay, that's the condition. Market. Are you in a buyer market or are you in a seller's market? Now, this is a little bit similar to the seller's time frame. Okay, so buying at the right market at the time frame is very important. Okay, neighborhood. In your neighborhood, do you have, for example, guns? People who create gunshots, homicides, killings. Is this high burglar rates place, or is it a safe area? Where the rich people stay. What are your neighbors like? Okay, that will more or less influence your property value as well. So these are the different factors. Are some of the factors that influence the property value. Okay, and more or less on a microeconomic level, those factors, if you were to magnify them, it would also influence the value of properties in a particular suburb or a council or even a state. Okay, if you were to magnify those factors. And so we talked about location. So in my opinion, there are 3 S's that we need to consider when it comes to location: station, school, and shopping. Okay, these are the 3 S's. Now, if we were to add perhaps a 4th S, it would be sports. So station, school, shopping, and sports. And really what this is about is creating convenience for people who want to live in there, whether you're an owner-occupier or you're a tenant. Okay, so convenience is something that people pay for, and that's what location can do for you. Now, we talked about the factors that are more or less related to the property or the suburb itself that would influence the property value. Let's talk about external factors. In this case, people's borrowing power, which is relevant to what the banks are offering to people in terms of interest rates and leveraging. So, how much you can actually borrow against the property. Right now, in 2020, the Reserve Bank of Australia, so the RBA, Reserve Bank of Australia, is the governing body that determines cash rate, which in turn then determines what each commercial bank offers in terms of its interest rate to the customers. The Reserve Bank of Australia has at the moment a cash rate of 0.25%. Okay, and probably by the time you are listening to this or watching this video, the cash rate could be up or could be down to maybe 0.1%. But in my opinion, it will never go to 0.0%. Okay, which means if it's 0% cash rate, it means people who want to make a little bit of interest by putting their money into term deposit would then have to pay the bank, which in Australia would be quite impossible, even though that's the case with some countries in Europe. But what this is trying to say is, at the moment, the Reserve Bank of Australia is having a cash rate of 0.25%. That's the lowest in the history of Australian property, okay? Which means this is probably by far the easiest time to get money from the bank. If we take away all the pandemic influence, this is by far the easiest time to get money from the bank, and it's also the cheapest money from the bank. Okay, and RBA is a governing body, as we said, that its cash rate is something that determines the commercial banks' rates, but also it is a governing body that would enable a stable balance between supply and demand and a healthy growth of the property market, and they do this by varying the cash rate. Okay, so in this case, because of the pandemic, we hope there is not a recession across the world, but because of the pandemic, the RBA is trying to stimulate the market by lowering the cash rate, so more and more people can afford properties and get into the property market and start buying. And that's as people start buying, then it would certainly trigger the construction industry and therefore create more jobs, and then good things follow. Okay, so this is a perfect time for people to buy properties because it is the cheapest money and the easiest money that you can get from the bank. When it comes to property investment, we say OPM is the best way to go. OPM stands for other people's money. Okay, other people's money, OPM, and generally we refer that to as the bank's money. Okay, if you can use the bank's money to make your own investment, that's good leverage, and we should always use that. So let's compare the growth of property value against the growth of the average full-time earnings. Okay, so these axes have been deflated by CPI. Okay, but in all fairness, you can see that from 1970 to 2015, or more or less sort of close to 2018, so to speak, the average full-time earning has probably doubled, perhaps, from this 100 index to 200, doubled in the last 45 years. Okay, so from 1970 to let's say 2018, 45, 48 years, close to 50 years. Okay, it's doubled. But what about the property price? Property price has at least quadrupled. Okay, in the last 45 years or so. Okay, so the way to get rich is never to earn your full-time earning and hope that'll help you to accumulate your wealth. No. The way to accumulate your wealth is always through investment into property, shares. In this case, property would resemble stable investment, and time is going to be your friend when it comes to helping you to accumulate wealth through property. So when property prices would double or quadruple in 40 or so years, this is the capital growth that you absolutely need to capture passively. So let's look at one example of how, in general, property value or the increase in property value can work in your favor when it comes to accumulate your wealth. Now, before we begin, we need to say a few things. First of all, in Australia, Australian banks or lenders have two very interesting but also very investor-friendly schemes. One of them is called interest only, and the other one is called refinance. Now, in a lot of countries, those two things do not exist. Okay, interest only means for the lifetime of your loan, or perhaps for the 5 years or 10 years, a fixed time of your loan, you only need to pay the interest and not the principal. Okay, that's what the interest only scheme means. That's what Australian banks would allow you to do. Okay, whether you're a foreigner or you're an Australian resident, same thing. The other thing called refinance means it's a program or a scheme that the bank can allow you to get money out of your property without selling your property. Okay, so effectively the bank would use the property as a security, and the bank would lend you more so you can have the access to the money or access to the equity and have cash literally in your hand without you selling the property. We can cover those two concepts in the next few modules, but just bear in mind that those two are very important concepts when it comes to property game in Australia. So let's say, for example, in year one, we're looking to buy a property that is worth $400,000. Okay, and let's say for the $400,000 property, we put down $100,000 as the down payment. So that's 25% of this property would be your equity, and you borrow from the bank $300,000. Okay, so the bank lends you 75% LVR, which stands for loan value ratio. So the bank lends you 75% of the value of the property as a loan principal. And let's say in the next few years, you pay interest only. Okay. Now, in year two, as we know, property grows in value. In year two, or year three in this case, let's say what in year one the property was worth $400,000. In year three, after 2 years, it's worth $500,000. Okay, so it's grown by 12.5%. Well, actually, no, it's grown by 25%. And in this case, the 100,000 that has grown since year one has again become your equity. Okay, because everything that is the value minus the loan, anything that is left over would be really your equity. Okay, so in this case, your loan hasn't changed, the principal hasn't changed because you're only paying interest. Okay, so it's going to be 300,000 for the lifetime of this property unless you sell it, and so the loan will just remain 300,000, but the value of the property has increased to 500,000, which means the equity is now 40%. Okay, you've added another 100,000 as the equity, and the loan, instead of becoming 75%, which is 300,000 on 400,000, is now 300,000 divided by 500,000, which is 60%. Now, as we go to, say, for example, year 8, okay, when the property value has doubled from 400,000 in year 1 to now 800,000 in year 8. Okay, now remember, our principal has not changed. The bank is only allowing to pay the interest. We only need to pay interest to the bank, and therefore the principal stays the same, 300,000. And because now the property is valued at 800,000 in year 8, the loan to value ratio is now 37.5%, and your equity now is 500,000. Okay, so from the 500,000 here, you've added another 300,000 in capital growth, which is now your equity. Okay, so in this case, your equity is 500,000 divided by 800,000. You would have 67.5% equity. And using refinance, you can then get cash from this green component here, okay, without selling the property. And after you get cash out of this, you can pretty much do whatever you want. You can pay for your holidays, you can pay for your cars, you can buy other investment properties. It's completely up to you. Okay, so using this method, by paying interest only and selecting the right properties so that the properties have its capital growth and you can have access to the equity of the property, have cash in hand without selling the property, you can literally create a snowball where one property can grow to 2, 2 can grow to 4, 4 can grow to 8. Okay, I know someone who has a portfolio of more than 250 properties, all starting from 1. Okay, so this is definitely the way to create wealth, and this is quite consistent with Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad, Poor Dad. It's definitely doable in Australia, and it's something that I'm personally doing as well. Okay, so this is all about letting time be your friend and using leverage, two leverages here. One is the time and the other one is the money from the OPM, other people's money from the bank. Okay, so this is about the property market, and in the next module, we're going to be covering how property investments actually works in Australia, and we'll go through the whole process of the property transaction, as well as working through how do we actually do property investment analysis, and how do we calculate things like profit, rate of return, the net return on investment, so on and so forth. Okay, so I'll see you in the next module.